This is Sleeping in Trees, the audiobook. Chapter 23, Stay Off Old Cutler. Given the tales, one might assume that I was raised in a world without rules. That would not be true. While we had rules, as a rule, we treated them more like general guidelines. However, some rules were laid out by my mother so sternly and with such force that we knew, without question, they were rules of substance, to be adhered to without sway. Much more than rules, they were laws, ironclad. There weren't many in this category, but the weightiest one of all, and the one that, when violated, caused me the most worry and fear was, "Do not ride on Old Cutler Road." She was serious, for a reason. Old Cutler Road was as old as South Miami. I did not know its origin, but would be willing to bet that it was a primary artery along Biscayne Bay east of Coral Gables and part south as a sandy trail in the late 1800s. In my childhood, it was still a two-lane paved road that traveled south from the Grove through South Miami and all the way down to Cutler Ridge, at least. It eventually merged with Old Dixie Highway and then rolled straight into the white ribbon in the sky, all the way to Key West. People hauled ass on Old Cutler Road. While the posted speed limit was 40 miles per hour, that appeared to be only a general guideline as well, since cars regularly traveled at 60 or 70. It had curves and was lined with very old oaks and in some spots massive banyan trees half the size of a small house. There were also plenty of blind driveways. The banyans, in particular, were scarred at strategic points where drivers over the many years had strayed a bit too far onto the shoulder. There were some horrific crashes on Old Cutler. Lying in bed deep in the night, on occasion, I would hear the eerie sound of the sirens in the distance and ponder the latest casualty. As soon as we could, a few of us would head down the shoulder of the road on foot and sometimes come upon the remnants. Black skid marks in the freshly scarred tree trunk, with bits of broken glass and the occasional hubcap marking a poor soul's tragic end. My mother's view was that if it was dangerous to drive on Old Cutler Road in a car, then it had to be at least as dangerous for a young boy to ride along it on a bike. Even crossing it could be a hit and miss affair. She was right. Why I was on the other side of Old Cutler one Sunday afternoon is today unclear. I had been messing around at Gables by the Sea. I might have been down at the sandbars at low tide, looking for horseshoe crabs and stingrays, or hunting land crabs with my slingshot along the mangrove-lined canals. I was alone. There were two entrances to Gables by the Sea. The primary one crossed over Old Cutler and dropped right into my neighborhood 2 blocks from my house. This was always the preferred route, since it had me on Old Cutler for just a matter of seconds. There was something about breaking a rule for a few seconds that seemed less serious than doing so for an extended period of time. As I approached the intersection, rather than shoot quickly across, I turned right onto Old Cutler and began to ride along the side of it. There existed no share-the-road bike lanes at that point in time, no real shoulder per se, just the crumbly side of the road, outside the white line bordered by dirt and grass. I had spotted a turtle along the roadside that I wanted to check out, or I thought I had. Sometimes the turtles we spotted were real, and other times they were just the shiny hump of an overturned palm frond. No turtle that day, so I pedaled on. The main entrance to my neighborhood was straight ahead. I was very careful to make sure there were no cars approaching head-on. It was wide open, all clear for at least a quarter of a mile ahead. Cars approaching from the rear, I neglected to consider. I cranked my Schwinn's Angel Wings to the left. I felt it before I even heard it, the loud screech of skidding tires and the powerful impact of a speeding car. I was launched head over heels through the air. Some say that often a traumatic accident can play out in slow-motion vignette with agonizing detail. Not for me. Hardly a short film clip, the event was explosive and violent, like a well-placed sucker punch to the side of the head. The big sedan smacked me hard, 2 tons of steel, traveling 50 miles an hour. My Stingray and I landed with a tumbling, crunching crash and skidded along the side of the road, rolling over and finally clumping to a convoluted stop on the grass shoulder. Soon a hysterical older man knelt beside me and helped me sit up. Perhaps the dumbest thing I've ever done was turn, without looking over my shoulder first, directly in front of a speeding car on Old Cutler Road. The luckiest thing that ever happened to me was that I turned a split second later than I might have. A touch of luck and a sliver of time tipped the scales my way. Luck and timing, they saved my life. This meant that rather than being run over and crushed by the big Buick, I was struck a glancing blow off of its right front fender. Rather than tumbling directly underneath the car, and surely being mangled beyond recognition, I was pitched forward and off to the side of the road. I even rolled to a stop under a large banyan tree in a patch of thick grass and weeds. The poor old guy was a wreck. So was I. Blood was pretty much everywhere. It gushed from what turned out to be a massive road rash and a laceration over my right eye next to my temple. I had a torn-up nose, ripped right shoulder, slashed knees, serrated palms, bashed elbows, and a badly sprained left wrist. Any body part that could have bounced and skidded down the gravel roadside did. Wearing only a t-shirt and shorts, there was lots of open skin to maul. The elderly man leaned over me shaking like a leaf. He repeatedly asked me if I was okay and where I lived. Now, past worrying about whether or not I was going to live, a sickening new realization swept over me. I might actually die after all, when my mother found out I had been run down on Old Cutler Road. I was prohibited from even crossing it, no less riding down the side of it. I had almost been killed, violating the most serious of rules my mother ever laid down. Now I felt real pain and anguish. How was I going to get out of there and back home without my mother's detection? With 4 young boys on the move, one would think she would often lose track and it would be easy to skate by at will. One would be wrong. Like a hawk from its perch high up in a loblolly, she was always surveying the landscape and keeping a close eye on her boys. Very little slipped by her gaze undetected. I went straight into survival mode, standing up quickly and attempting to brush myself off. Though now largely covered in blood from numerous scrapes and cuts, a dusting off was not going to happen. Any cleanup at that point was ineffective, to say the least. The old guy fetched a white towel from his car and continued to ask how I felt as he offered it to stanch the blood. I repeated that I was just fine and only lived up the street and would be home in a few minutes. I added that I was sorry for denting his fender and would be on my way and that he needn't worry. The old gent wasn't buying any of it and made it quite clear that he would take me home. On a second thought, as he glanced at his Buick's ivory leather interior, he suggested he just follow me. He repeated that he couldn't possibly leave me in such a mangled state. Again, I insisted that I was fine and would be on my way. I dragged my bleeding leg over my banana seat, wrenched the handlebars into a semi-straight position, very carefully looked both ways along Old Cutler, looked both ways a second time, thanked him again, checked just one more time both ways, and pedaled my crooked bike for home. As I rolled off, the bent front wheel bumped up and down. I looked over my shoulder to see the old guy still standing next to his dented right front fender, holding a bloody towel and watching me keenly. I must have been a fright, dripping blood and wobbling down the road into my neighborhood. Even my handlebars were sticky, as both of my lacerated palms oozed crimson. My adrenaline was pumping when I rounded the bend onto Vista Lane. I saw my house up ahead, third on the right. There was no telling, from my line of sight, who was home. Mr. Sobel, the children's author, Encyclopedia Brown, was just pulling out of his garage for a Sunday drive in his antique Lincoln, circa 1920. He gave me an odd glance and waved as he drove away, staring at me in his rearview mirror. My plan was to simply head into the garage and gingerly peek into the kitchen to see if it was going to be possible to limp unseen into my bedroom. With the bathroom adjacent, I'd be able to ease myself into the tub, rinse off, and inspect the damage. If I was in luck, my mother would be on the patio having an iced coffee at a little brown wicker table facing the pool. I'd be able to sneak right by. I was starting to feel serious pain. My head throbbed. My plan was foiled. Unbeknownst to me, the old guy had slowly trailed me in his dented Buick all the way home, with no intention of letting me go on my way. For all he knew, I had a concussion, and most certainly did, or worse. He was a good man. Turning into my driveway, he pulled slowly to a stop. He stepped out of his car, looked at me, walked up to our front door, and rang the doorbell. As a reckless brood, my brothers and I were always getting into it, and injuries of a wide variety were a common occurrence, especially on Sundays. Whether it was fighting, accidents with various weapons, falls from heights, tackle football barefoot in shorts and T-shirts, or bike crashes, our young lives were a 24-hour assembly line of bumps, cuts, and bruises. So, as expected, to elicit more than a sideways glance from Mom and Dad, an injury of some magnitude was required. Basic bruises, general scrapes, and minor lacerations did not qualify, nor did rashes, burns, insect or non-venomous snake bites. Only broken limbs, severe burns, or deep cuts requiring stitches qualified for medical assistance. In a pinch, on a Sunday afternoon, if an injury was deemed worthy, my mother and father might resort to Plan B. Our next-door neighbor was a veterinarian. Given the esteem with which my mother held her various pets, a veterinarian was as good as a full-blown doctor in her eyes. If the injury of the day was serious, they would sometimes walk next door and ask Dr. Brown to come and take a look. On more than one occasion, he would amble over to appease my mother. He was an enormous man with an equally large cropping of pure white hair. My guess was that he tended to large animals. In fact, I believe I had evidence. If one crawled up between the decorative shrubbery along his driveway and his screened-in pool, there on full view, on a dark back wall in his patio area, framed by palms and stands of bamboo, was an 8-foot-tall mural of an angry gorilla with a ferocious, gaping maw below a crinkled-up, stubby black nose and piercing yellow eyes. To my thinking, Dr. Brown's mural would have been oddly out of place if his patients were only kittens and chihuahuas. That Sunday, he looked me over as I lay on the living room couch and agreed I was a mess. He suggested I take some aspirin, and if my headache became severe, or if I fainted or started vomiting, that I head to a doctor of the human variety, Stat. In the end, I recovered nicely and was back in full form by the next weekend, happily tooling around on my Stingray with a new front wheel, well away from Old Cutler Road. Somehow, I had wiggled by and there was no punishment for violating the Old Cutler Road rule. As sometimes happens with parents, I believe both of them were just thankful that I was still alive. My mom was a chain smoker, and I was not happy about her repulsive habit. Up next is Chapter 24, and it's called Cigarette Roulette.